So welcome to TrueWorks podcast, the podcast that equips you to understand how the gospel can transform the way you live your life and the way that you work. I am your host, Joshua Smith, and with me is my co-host, Doug Meikle. Doug, welcome to the show.
Welcome. Yes, I'm glad to be here.
I'm glad that you feel welcome, and I'm glad that you're here.
So welcome.
Yes.
Just feel so welcome right now.
The topic that we're going to be diving into today is the topic of worldview. Worldview. Now, this is beginning to sound like a resounding theme. This is a difficult topic to dive into because it hides itself so much. Everybody has one of these, but it's kind of hard to see it yourself because you're walking around with it all the time, this issue of worldview.
Well, yeah. I guess I'd say that a little bit differently. I think that most people, there are some level at which it's easy to understand. I'll get to an illustration of that in a minute.
Okay.
That we all have a worldview. But it's the more subtle things that actually, when there's harder for people to perceive, more difficult for people to understand that they are indeed, as you say, carrying a whole bunch of stuff around with them. The illustration I often give of worldview, I grew up in the UK, of course, I grew up in Europe. And hunting, for example, there is generally the domain of the wealthy because you need access to land, of course, and land is at a premium there. And the open land is often owned by people who are pretty wealthy. So if you want to hunt in Europe, then generally, this is not exclusively true, but generally you've got money, you've got access to resources to be able to buy access to the land. Now you come and live in Texas, of course, and that's totally different. There's lots of access to land, and hunting's the kind of an everyman thing. Mm-hmm. So if you come with the worldview, the kind of way in which you see the world and the assumptions about the world from Europe, you might assume that a Texas hunter is this wealthy landed guy that has access to a whole bunch of land and therefore is able to hunt. What you would miss is that no, that's actually not the way the world works here. The way the world works here is that you can actually do that. Pretty much everybody does that. It's relatively easy to do that. So that's a kind of illustration of the typical worldview that people, that's easily accessible. There's a bunch of assumptions that we have around the world that we carry around with us. And those assumptions are the basis by which we interpret other things that happen in the world around us. Mm-hmm. Yeah?
Yeah, and that getting into those assumptions, that's where that subtlety is going to come up because it's going to affect the way that we interact with the world that we are viewing.
Yeah. So my related thing.
You're a hunter.
No, I'm not a hunter.
Okay,
I'm
I
definitely
thought you were
not
going to go there.
No, I'm not going to go
like
there.
Panther or like lion hunting?
Absolutely not.
It's probably illegal.
No, it is illegal, Joshua. Stop that.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It's my related discussion there would be related. Second Amendment. The Second Amendment here in the United States is kind of widely understood as at least a reality, that the access to firearms is important for us in maintaining some level of independence from the government. And you can support that at various different levels, but it's certainly something that's in the fabric of our country here. Now, the perspective of the European on that is typically that it is borderline insane, that folks would have widespread access to firearms that way and be able to use them and just carry them around. I mean, it's basically crazy. So if you want to have that conversation between, say, your typical Frenchman or your typical German and your typical American from Ohio or from Texas or from upstate New York or from rural California, you're going to get a pretty heated conversation that really is the illustration of two different worldviews, that they see the world in an entirely different way. And it's not going to be, well, it could be perfectly pleasant, but it's going to be pretty heated.
Yeah. I mean, there's going to be certainly differences there. And one of the ways that the reason why we are have that differing worldview in that particular topic. It's because we're so much different, so different than these other European countries who have this long heritage and history that they can kind of be unified around, and us as a melting pot in our like beginning. Like we have to seek some kind of unity, and everyone knows it's important. Now, it's important not to have the amendment or to have the amendment. That's where the heatedness comes. But yeah, it frames the way that we approach these, because all the Europeans are on there on the sideline thinking, why are y'all like discussing this? Like, this shouldn't even be a discussion.
This is not a thing.
Yeah.
It's just not a thing. So, I think the other thing, so I'm obviously an immigrant here, came here 30 years ago, and I think one of the interesting things I had to come to terms with pretty early on is that I think that even as someone growing up in Europe, if it's pretty clear that French people are not like and have different values or a different way of seeing the world than Brits. And that's accentuated by the fact you go there and they speak a totally different language. So you're kind of aware of the fact that you're different.
Yeah.
You come to America, and fair enough, Americans speak a little bit English a little bit differently, as I speak a little bit differently. But you kind of assume we have the same language, so we're just kind of the same people. And you soon realize that, wait, no, we're actually not the same. There's just as much difference between a Brit and an American, in some ways, as there between a Brit and a Frenchman or Italian woman. It's just there are different cultures, different ways of seeing the world, different histories produce what we are going to call worldview that informs the way you see the world.
Yeah, and it comes to be, we're going to talk about, tremendously important because of the way that it affects not only these kind of abstract sets of belief propositions about what we think of an amendment, but how we live and act and go about our lives. Here at TrueWorks, we're particularly interested in how your life finds meaningful work, but worldview is way bigger than that. That it encompasses the whole
world
of life.
The clue is in the name.
Sense
the clue's in the name. Worldview.
Be more attending to the terms that I'm using. You may get the sense that worldview. Okay, so everybody has a worldview, that everybody comes to the table, so to speak, with different kinds of presuppositions and beliefs. Okay, well, I mean, that's interesting. I guess it's interesting the way different people see things. But what we're going to look at now is, well, it's not just that people see things differently, but that there can be different and better ways of seeing things. Worldviews can be better or worse. And
Hitler had a worldview, for example.
And it was not a very good one.
No, but it worked. It seemed to work for him for a while.
It did work.
So even the utility of a worldview doesn't necessarily make it right.
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, I mean, it worked for him in some very narrow, like sadistic sense, and didn't work tragically for 11 or 13 million other people.
Yeah. But the point about that, I think it's important, is that, so it could be the case that you would say, whatever your worldview is cool, right? Whatever.
Yeah.
Right?
Hey, different strokes for different folks.
That's fine. But it turns out, no, that's not fine. And that there really is an opportunity, more than just an opportunity, a need to try and frame the world and understand the world as it truly is and interact with it as it truly is. And that's one of the things, actually, if you want a way of thinking about the Christian faith and what it is, it's learning how to interact with the world as it truly is. It's not just an issue of believing the right things. It's actually not really just doing the right things either. It's some combination of living in the world as God has called you to live, and Jesus has given us the opportunity to do so.
You touch on a point. It's not just about living in the world and doing good things. I think a lot of people have this idea that Christianity is just this moral code, and certainly it has these moral precepts. 10 Commandments are a real thing, but when we think of Christianity and the person of Christ, Christianity is making a claim about what is real, that there is God, that there are humans that have a particular kind of relationship that's been broken. It's making a truth claim. And that,
yeah. I sometimes think that's not the most. Well, you're the philosopher, I'm not, but
that's
sometimes
true.
think, yes, that is true. Yes, that's a badge of honor for me, just to be clear. Anyway, but moving on. I guess what I'm trying to say here is that ultimately, and I think this is what is taught to us in the Bible, is that is that foundationally, we are made to be in relationship with God. That is the foundation of all. And out of that relationship, we are enabled to live as we are called to live, to obey as we are called to obey, and have relationships restored between our fellow human beings and the created world around us. That seems to me to be this full and whole life that you could, if you like, describe as not just a worldview, but a way of living in the world as well, which is, I don't know, I don't want that to sound kind of esoteric, but that's... I think that's something that we kind of deeply lack. I think, anyway, but that's probably a pause.
Deeply lack living in the world in this full way.
In an authentic way, yeah, for sure. That's the source of the alienation that I think we see amongst so many people today, the source of their loneliness, the source of their disconnection to the world and to their neighbor. And that, what does that leave them? That leaves them isolated and lonely, and those very things are reported today and measured and to the at levels that have never been reported before.
It alienates, and I think I don't want to put words into your mouth. It alienates us from what is actually real. Would that be a correct way to say that?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, and I think again we're maybe getting a bit further on than just our readings for this week, but or are we? I don't know, because each of those readings this week are about someone that we've heard of before who had a particular way of seeing the world, a particular way of what is good in the world, why am I here, what am I supposed to do, those kinds of things. Those are the big questions that together build up a worldview, and also then drive how I interact with the world, how I go to work every day, how I love my wife or my husband. Those kind of things are driven by the worldview that we have. What's good and true?
Yeah.
What am I here for?
Yeah. What's beautiful as well.
What's beautiful?
Yeah. So New Begin talks about truth. Bertrand talks about ultimate reality. But it's just these things that are not just, we all have a worldview, but that it affects many levels, family, work, and that there has to be some test that we can start to analyze in ourselves, but also appreciate in others of, okay, there are better ways and worse ways to be attuned to the realities and the truest stories that there are.
I think there's a nuance there that, so Leslie Newbigin, you guys are going to read this week a section of a piece of work by a guy called Leslie Newbigin, and I think he is, in the Christian world, he's well known because of a journey from seminary in the UK to a role as I guess what would have been called then a missionary to South India, and then returning to the UK for the last 20 years or so of his life, 20, 30 years of his life, having been a missionary for 20 or 30 years, and realizing all these missional tools that he was taught to go out and analyze the culture of this alien place in India were just as relevant in Birmingham when he came home to the UK. That the culture of the culture and worldview of this place that was kind of by heritage Christian had now moved so far. The only way the Christian could relate to it was through these kind of missional principles.
Interesting.
Now, he's actually reading one of his books really changed my life a long time ago, The Foolishness to the Greeks. He wrote, again, that was some time ago, but he's a great author and died relatively recently, but great and insightful author.
That you have to be a missionary to these
that your culture,
that
100%. And I think this is the confusion oftentimes that we have in North America, is that we assume when we say things like this is a Christian country, I think I guess there are reasons why we would say something like that, but I think there's a grave danger there that we assume we're not missionaries to this culture, and that the culture is somehow intrinsically good. And I think that is today disastrously wrong, I think. And we, I think, as Christians need to kind of have the posture towards culture that we are missionaries towards it. That is an alien thing to the culture that we want to try and live and thrive within. Yeah.
And it's a little easy and a little more palatable in a city as multicultural as Houston to think of, wow, our mission is our neighbor.
Yeah.
I mean, it's,
well, maybe easier for us to come to terms with that, or easier for us for that fact to kind of poke a hole in our worldview, but it's real all the same.
Yeah, it's real even in cities that are not like Houston.
Yeah.
That's right. So let's look at some. We've looked at some aspects. We've touched on some what a worldview could potentially look like and how it could potentially affect our day-to-day. Can we look a little more abstractly about the components of worldview? There's several questions that you can go through to kind of orient yourself in order to see what is this person's or my worldview. Fundamental questions like, who am I? What's wrong with the world? What shall I do? Where am I going where I die? These are not all the questions that you could ask of a worldview, but these are questions that are trying to get you to see the kind of cosmic, universal glue, if you will, stitching together of the various components of your life, of the fundamental orientations and pursuits in your life. We don't often, well, I say sometimes we don't think of these questions explicitly, but the answers to them drive our everyday actions and long goal.
So in the readings we're going to give you this week, there are going to be some short illustrations of writers that you would be familiar with: Benjamin Franklin, Machiavelli, and Plato. And we're going to ask you to ask these questions of them, because who are we as people? What's wrong with us? What's the solution to what's wrong with us? And where are we ultimately going? What's that? All of that's going to be, even these short pieces of reading that we're going to give you this week are going to be pretty obvious to you in each of these three folks. And the answers to those questions are going to be quite different in each of those three. And what we wanted to do is kind of use those to actually make you reflect on, wait a minute, what do I think is wrong with us as people? What do I think the solution is? Where do I think that I'm going? What is true and good and useful, etc.? And it will help illustrate that, wait, hold on, I don't maybe have the same beliefs as Benjamin Franklin about morality, for example, but I do have beliefs about morality, and those things are shaping what I think are the right things to do on a day-by-day basis. And that's what we want you to try and think about in this worldview thing. Not that it's worldviews or something that other people have, but worldview is something we all have and must have. Otherwise, it's impossible to do anything in the world.
Would you like to share, Doug, the great illustration that Calvin has? As he's not talking about worldview explicitly, but the idea is the exact same.
Yeah. So actually, Calvin is using, and that's John Calvin. He is using this, not Calvin as in Calvin and Hobbes. I feel I've got to make that clear for young people like you.
That's true. Yeah. So which one are you talking about?
I'm talking about John Calvin, not the
cat.
Oh,
I thought you were talking about
the cat.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I guess you can talk about him too.
Okay. So, yes. That would be funny if it wasn't possibly true. Anyway, moving on. So, Calvin, that in this case being John Calvin, used this illustration of how the Bible works, but it also works in the sense of what worldview is, and he called it spectacles for a bleary-eyed man, and you can see that how that analogy works in the sense that if you don't have good eyesight, then the world to you is not quite formed correctly. It's blurry and it's certainly not in sharp focus. But as you put those spectacles on, the world becomes clear and into sharp relief. And his point in all of that is that, actually, his point in that was really how the Bible works, and you can think of it, that is the purpose of the Christian worldview, to put those glasses on, and everything becomes clear. Everything becomes clear. But if those glasses are not the Christian worldview, then they are going to have their own flaws and imperfections, and you're not going to see the world as it truly is. And that, I think, is a really powerful, it's a powerful example at a lot of different levels. One is that they have this illustration of bringing the world into relief, into clarity, but also that your worldview is not a thing. It's a thing you see through. Right? That you actually, its only purpose is to try and see clearly what's going on around you.
You don't look at your glasses.
No, you look through your glasses.
You look through your glasses to see other things in the world.
And I think so but also if those glasses are not right, you can also see, okay, I'm not seeing the world as I should see it. And the whole way I want you guys to think about worldview is that if I establish a Christian worldview in my life, it will help me see the world as it truly is, but also interact with the world as I should. And that's the that's the power, I think, of the concept. It's not perfect as a concept, but it's certainly I think it's certainly pretty helpful.
Yeah. And what you have discovered and what I have discovered through this Faith Work Intensive is that, of course, everybody has a worldview, but there are things that are indeed out of focus, that Christians are claiming to be Christian, but there are blind spots. There's the fullness of revelation, of good, meaningful work or beautiful creativity, or the relationship with your neighbor or your family or those at your work, so on, that are not in correct focus. And that's not because we have the wrong glasses, but because those spectacles need to be corrected. They need to be polished. They need to be wiped clean. And we hope that the Faith Work Intensive and interacting with these authors make us more cognizant of those areas.
And, why do we do this at the start of this Faith Work Intensive? Because, again, we're trying to give you the basic tools that you can then examine your work and see it clearly for what it is, see its intrinsic value. But also, if we're able to clarify and polish up those glasses, also see its imperfections. Give you an opportunity to go out and look at the imperfections of your not just your work, but your work in the context of your industry, and say, okay, what's your mission now? Is there something there that you can fix? You can be a part of the redemptive process of that work or industry.
Because bringing things into sharp focus may bring things into sharp focus that are ugly and flawed, that God is calling you to redeem and to renew. It's not going to be all rosy if we have clear glasses, because the world is not full of all rosy things, and that's why Jesus and God are redeeming it.
So one other thing about doing this together with other folks that I think is helpful for people to grasp is that it's like, who would you ask to describe water? Not a fish, because the fish swims in it every day. For him, it is just the medium of their life. Who would you ask to describe water? Someone that doesn't live in the water the way the fish does. So I think by the same token, sometimes you're going to find in this cohort, this group of people looking at industries and jobs within those industries, that it will be from the outside that people are more clearly able to see, hey, have you thought about this, or have you thought about that? The community element of this here is also pretty important too. The polishing process is not Doug heading off, to kind of do that stuff on his own. It's Doug with his cohort of people considering this together, helping him see the things that he could never see on his own. That's
the beauty of Christian community, is that we're able to sharpen and encourage one another. And maybe we've been so focused and isolated and narrow in what we've been thinking of in our work that we can't see the bigger picture that our friends are going to help us bring into relief. Yeah. That's great. What I want to do now, so we've talked a little about Christianity being a worldview. We could answer those fundamental questions I feel like that will maybe be a little too wooden just to go through those questions about who am I. We're gonna who am I? Where am I going? What shall I do? What you can think of as the faith work intensive is those questions will be continually returned to and answered as we try to build a Christian worldview. But all this emphasis on worldview, I don't want you to get the impression that somehow Christianity can be reduced to a worldview.
Yeah.
Worldview is a tool that we're using in order, a very useful tool to understand our faith.
Yeah. So remember that in the journey we've got so far on these podcasts, we've tried to emphasize the fact that our Christian faith is foundationally a relationship.
Yeah.
And what we're trying to give you here is a tool to help you better understand that relationship. It's not a replacement for that relationship. And sometimes, and maybe I'm a bit like this. Sometimes I'm the analytical guy. I'm an engineer by training, and worldview really helps with that. It helps you analyze things and helps you see things the right way. But that's not, if that's all you've got, you don't have that much. Yeah. I think ultimately we have, as Christians, a relationship with God, and that's the foundation of everything.
Yeah, yeah. So worldview can be used in this artificial way, but we want to emphasize that. Love and relationship are the things that are compelling us first, not as an afterthought of looking at our own worldview, but also looking at others as you not only look at these classic and older authors that we're going to with the Prince, with Machiavelli and Franklin and Plato, but looking at our neighbors and the people that we're working with, looking at our other family members, and taking the posture of Jesus of wanting to first listen and understand before we start to do any kind of analysis or breaking down or inconsistencies or something like that, which that's my impulse as someone who wants to defend the faith, wants to show that it's relevant and true, that it can stand up under scrutiny. I want to instantly go into this kind of compare and show the triumph of the Christian worldview. And I think that it can do that, but that is not our primary goal in looking at this tool.
No, and I think use this tool to also interpret your work environment. The crude example that I always get, is it crude or unsophisticated?
I'll tell you in just a moment.
Okay, thank you. The example I often give is if you work around salespeople, and they often have a very clear view of the world. Yeah, there's a very transactional view of the world because ultimately, if you're in a big organization, very typically they're paid to see the world in a transactional way. That when they sell stuff and when they win, they get paid. So whether that's all those cliches start coming out about sales guys being coin operated, or they eat what they kill, all those things that describe. Yeah, that's the way sales guys are, the way they're described. But what that tends to do, I think, is that you tend to do two things. One is you pay people to think like that. Yeah. So you pay them commission or whatever, and they start thinking that the world is transactional in its nature. But the second thing is you start attracting people who want to see the world like that. I think that whole element of worldview and what comes first, did she think about the world that way, or did I train her to think about the world that way, is a pretty interesting question if you're a manager in that context. What am I trying to do? What behaviors am I really trying to drive here? And I think that's something where, a very practical consequence of how do I see the world and worldview? Will you get the best relationship from that sales guy with his customers, or will she just simply see them as a transaction that could or could not happen? Those are all pretty practical and important questions that show up all the time in the course of your work.
Well, I think that's a great place to end this podcast. Thank you so much for listening to this podcast episode by TrueWorks. I've been your host, Joshua Smith, and this has been my co-host, Doug Meikle. If you want to learn more about TrueWorks and what we're up to and the other activities that we're doing in and around Houston, please visit our website at trueworkshouston.org. You can find this podcast and others anywhere podcasts can be found. Thank you again, and we look forward to next time.
Thank you.